partners, the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator, on just and accessible climate finance. I really am happy to see you all here today, given the importance of it. I know that we are baking in this heat, so it also lends itself to really understanding the importance of the topic and why we are here today. Before I start, I just would like to say that this is a hybrid session. We have persons online, as you can see, as well as in person, you all here in the heat basking with me. So unfortunately, we do not have any translation services available for those online. My apologies, but we will surely send a transcript following this meeting. So I am Geneva Oliveri. I'll be your moderator today. I am a development specialist at the Caribbean Policy Development Center, headquartered in Barbados. We are a regional body, however, we are headquartered in Barbados. And surely from my accent, you know we're regional because I'm Trinidadian. So welcome again. I would like to first introduce our esteemed panelists. We have, and let me know if I pronounce your name incorrectly. We have Maureen Penjuli, and she's the coordinator for the Fiji-based Pacific Network on Globalization. PANG is the acronym. It's a regional non-governmental organization that focuses on promoting the rights of Pacific Island people to be self-determined. She has almost 30 years experience in the not-for-profit sector with a primary focus on the Pacific region. Thank you very much for being here. We also have Ms. Cheryl Senhouse, representing our partners here today. She is the Finance Innovation Director with the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator. And she was responsibility for fundraising and climate finance solutions, financial management, etc. And she is an experienced strategy and finance leader. So we are happy to have her here with her extensive knowledge, and we just hope to hear a little bit more from you. We also have online Mr. Christopher Sinkler. He's an international trade and development specialist with 30 years experience working in public, private sector, and civil society sectors in Barbados and internationally, Caribbean and internationally. He is the former Minister of Finance and Economic Affairs for Barbados, and he served as a Greek governor in the World Bank, most recently IMF, and now he's at the Inter-American Development Bank on the One Caribbean campaign. Thank you very much for being here as well. We also have Mr. Jawala Rambaran at the end, my countryman. He is the Senior Policy Advisor for the Caribbean Policy Development Center, and he advises on sovereign debt, climate finance, and reform of the global financial architecture, especially as it relates to the impact on SIDS, small island developing states. He's also the former governor of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. And we have, last but not least, we have Ms. Patricia Sheko, can I call you Pat? And she has decades of experience in Caribbean development with specific focus on environmental economics. Her career includes appointments in World Bank, the Nature Conservancy, leading on conservation efforts in several Caribbean territories, the Inter-American Development Bank, as well as most recently USAID. So thank you again for being here. And I would now like to pass you over to the opening remarks, the head of CPDC, the officer in charge, Mr. Richard Jones, who would bring us to usher us into this wonderful session.
Good evening, and thank you all for being here today with us. Sessions like these, we think, are important for us in the region. I think we all recognize, and we have a whole panel here, so we'll go further than this, we'll acknowledge the real impact that climate change and climate crisis has been having to our region. At the center, we are a regional umbrella body representing non-governmental organizations across the entire Caribbean, and we interact on a practically monthly basis at two national consultations and engagement across the region. So we get to see the real impact on the lives of those most vulnerable, whether it's in the indigenous communities that we're working in, whether it's in the indigenous communities that we're working in, or whether it is with small farmers, women in rural communities. We get to appreciate and see the real impact. So we move beyond the statistics that show us that there is an impact to actually seeing it on the ground. So we had to just convene this session today to ensure that we are able to give credence to much of our work, and also to educate you and on some of the issues that we've been working on as well. we see that climate finance is a big issue for us. We all know whether it's slow onset or whether it is issues pertaining to very visible and intense hurricanes, there's significant impact on our people, there's significant impact on the lives in our countries. Each year it requires one of our countries or many of our countries to incur more and more debt, which makes our model and where we live very challenging for economic planning and economic development. With further ado, Geneva, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much.
Because I think our expert should speak on the critical issues that we were faced with. So thank you for coming today, and we look forward to your active participation.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you. So in this session, we really seek to address the vulnerabilities that Richard highlighted and in terms of access to climate finance mechanisms and products that build resilience. So we would really like to hear now from our panelists, and I would start now. So in terms of the status of overall development and sovereign debt in small island developing states, what does it mean for these countries' ability to address the climate crisis and their debt levels ultimately? Joala, can we start with you? Can you respond citing to this site in a Caribbean perspective?
All right. Thanks so much, Geneva. First, I would actually say that Caribbean SIDS are caught in what I would term a vicious mid-income country debt for climate change trap. And that is because the fiscal resources that they would generally use for education, for health, for social services, and even to fund out their climate ambitions, those resources are increasingly being diverted into debt service. And while that is happening, the impact of particularly more powerful storms in the region is in a sense being priced into the cost of debt, meaning that debt is rising, and then that in itself is again leading to more debt. So we now end up with a situation where we have 6 Caribbean SIDS that are in the top 10 of the most heavily indebted SIDS in the world. So at the end of 2023, we had 6 Caribbean countries whose debt to GDP ratios were in excess of 80% of GDP, right? And those countries are in a particular order: Barbados, Suriname, Dominica, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Bahamas, and Trinidad and Tobago. And in this particular case, if you actually look at the data that is publicly available on the IMF site for Trinidad and Tobago, it would never suggest that this country is in a difficult debt situation. But if you actually go and look at the numbers that come out from the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, you will see a different situation, which actually says that instead of the 50% GDP number that the IMF produces for Trinidad, the number is actually closer to 80%. Right? But be that as it may, those are 6 countries already in this range. We have another 4: Antigua and Barbuda, St. Lucia, Jamaica, and Grenada, whose debt to GDP ratios are between 60 to 80% of GDP. And we know there are studies in the region that actually show that beyond a 60% debt to GDP threshold, that debt is considered no longer sustainable. And it will have an impact on growth and development. So what this suggests is that we now have 10 countries at the moment in the Caribbean that are heading towards significant debt distress. And I actually consider this, I mean, we have the issue around the liquidity issue, which is there's just this wave of debt service payments coming up into the next 2 to 3 years. But beyond that, these countries actually have a solvency issue, because it is unlikely under current initiatives and current circumstances that these countries could come out from this debt trap. And we've had the link of a lot of this debt accumulation in many SIDS, many Caribbean SIDS, to climate events. I only have to just reference maybe one event, which is Dominica, in 2017, where we saw the impact of Hurricane Maria that completely devastated Dominica to the extent that the loss and damage was around 225% of GDP. So that's more than twice your overall economic activity lost in one night. Right. Then more recently, we had Bahamas and the impact of tropical Hurricane Dorian that loss and damage there was again 25% of GDP. This year, we now have a forecast that says this is in a sense, the worst forecast that we've seen in the history for the Caribbean when it comes to tropical storms and hurricanes. The expectation is that we're going to have close to about 25 tropical storms, of which almost half of those, so we're looking at somewhere between now 12 to 13, are going to be hurricanes. And again, another half of those are going to form into major hurricanes, category 3, 4, or 5. So we're looking at somewhere between 5 to 6 major hurricanes are projected for this Atlantic season. And therefore, we know if any one of those, or even one of the smaller hurricanes would, if that were to materialize, the impact it would have on debt and then growth and development prospects, basically taking us back at least a decade or two. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jawala, for that. I guess it's quite sobering to hear it. I didn't want to open on such a sobering note, but hopefully we will end on a brighter one. So we have heard what is going on the current state of play in the Caribbean. Maureen, I would like to hear from you. Can you give us a specific SIDS perspective on this?
Good afternoon, everyone, and Bola Vinaka. Before I just launch into the depressing status further, I really just wanted to thank CPDC for the invitation to participate on this very critical topic. And I just wanted to start by saying that the story of climate finance is not just a story about money, liquidity, and financing, but it is a story about history, exploitation, and how to reenact accountability. And I just want to pick up from where Jawala talked about debt servicing. And I think the stats is really, really quite stark. If you look at World Bank and OECD figures, the global South are likely to pay out 50 billion more in 2024 than they received in grants or loans, which means that the capital flows is going from the weak to the strong, right? We know that SIDS debt across, whether we in the Caribbean, Pacific, it rose from 42.3% of GDP in 2000 to about 60% in 2022. And that story is really true for my country, Fiji, which is classified as a middle-income country. And the point about IMF simply using these measures as middle-income country just denies the kinds of real needs that's taking place internally. So I want to flag that this kinds of measures or labels at the IMF, World Bank, we're lucky that the World Bank has classified as a blended country, which means that we can qualify for some concessional loans. But my country, Fiji, obviously our debt has been increasing steadily over the last decade, but 2016 was a critical moment. Why? Because Category 5 Cyclone Winston hit Fiji. The government estimated the cost of recovery at about $2 billion. That's 2 times the size of our entire economy. We had to borrow for recovery. And as the country, so that saw a spike in our debt from 2016. And of course, COVID. I think we have to place COVID squarely in terms of debt when we're talking about debt, because in Fiji's case, it pushed our debt to 91% in 2022 to GDP. That was its highest, and that was after a tourism. Many of us are tourism-based economies, totally collapsed. Government had to launch a COVID-19 response package. Again, we had to borrow. So when we're talking about servicing and really understanding what servicing that 16% of government revenue is now spent on servicing debt. That's not even talking about principal. We're just servicing the interest rates of debt. Our finance minister reported 2 weeks ago that that amounts to about 80 to 90 million per month, $1 billion per year. All money that should be going to health, education, agriculture, infrastructure, diversifying our economies, the real things that can get us on track. What we're seeing is that austerity measures come into play again, thanks again to the multilateral development banks. They're insisting that we increase our tax base, which means VAT goes up. There goes really the bulk of burden of debt servicing falls on our poor people again. So I just want to say that when we're looking at debt, and I know that SIDS have taken positive steps to establish a dedicated debt sustainability support service, but I think I want to really just go back to some of our government initiatives, which our governments went in 2021 to creditors to ask for debt cancellation. And I think that should remain on the board as part and complemented by the broader systemic challenges to debt as debt cancellation. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you again, another sobering note, but we're moving towards solutions. Cheryl, from a climate perspective, what are some of the main climate related risks facing Caribbean states?
So thank you for having us, and we're pleased to be able to partner with CPDC on this panel on this initiative. I think my fellow panelists have done an excellent job at painting the picture, although it is a sobering picture. And I'd want to follow your lead and move into solutions. You asked what are the main risks? And I think summarizing what's been said so far, one of the main risks is also financial. So we understand catastrophic events and the impacts that those have on economies, on livelihoods, on infrastructure. We also understand the impact of slow onset events in terms of impacts on biodiversity, again, loss of livelihoods, degradation of the environment. The solution to both of those things requires funding. So how do we prepare for and adapt to the risks that we see on a day-to-day basis from climate change? It requires a mobilization of finance. It also requires a mobilization of fit-for-purpose finance. So we've seen recently the initiatives that have been advanced by several of the SIDS countries successfully to date, calling for reform and insisting on, and in some instances, having been successful in achieving some reforms in the international financial architecture. Those are important steps, but we need to accelerate that progress. We need to see more deeper and more systemic change within the international finance community. And we also need to see that change trickling down into our private finance community as well. While we look to governments for the infrastructure, the social services, for the framework that guides our day-to-day activities, there's also a role for the private sector to play. And we also need to see that change trickling down into those sectors. So there has been the thrust for green finance, sustainable finance, impact finance. We need to see that being expanded. But we also need to understand that, particularly for SIDS and particularly for vulnerable economies, even as those things are being developed, we need to see justice. We're now faced with the potential for being locked out of trade because of changes that are happening outside of our regions, which now require us again to be able to build capacity and put resources towards being able to meet requirements to be able to continue to sustain our livelihoods. Is the potential impact positive? Yes, the outcomes are positive, but it also requires that we now need to, as my fellow panelists have said, rechannel more of our limited funding into achieving those objectives. So I think the financial risk and the ability, the cost of action or inaction, I think is the overarching and the overarching connection between all of the physical risks that we experience from climate change. And we need to be able to effectively manage those to build resilience, to build preparedness, and also to recover from impacts when we're faced with them.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Cheryl. You've already started to get into the solutions, but before we do that, I would like to hear from Pat and Chris on what's just an overview before we really get into the depth of it. What is your take on the current efforts to address what was highlighted here? I know that you both worked in the development sector at USAID, at the IDB, at the World Bank. So from that perspective, and I'll start with you, Pat, and then we'll get to Chris. Chris, I see that you're unmuted. If you don't mind, sure. Pat, I will go to Chris. And Chris, just give a little sense of that and overviews before we segue really into the deeper concerns.
Okay. Are you hearing me?
Quite clearly.
Okay, great. Thanks. First of all, let me thank CPDC for the invitation to participate in this, and also to do a little housekeeping to say that, of course, any comments that I make here, I'm obliged to say this. You know, when you're working for international organizations, do not reflect the views of the board or directors of the institution. It's not an institutional view; it's a personal view expressed in my own private capacity. Having had gotten that out of the way, housekeeping out of the way, I think I share the sentiments that have been expressed, I think, quite brilliantly by members of the panel thus far in capturing the real significant challenge facing SIDS, in particular, other developing countries generally, in this very, very fluid international environment, which has been characterized, as you heard, by a series of significant crises that have, in fact, impacted quite significantly. It's not only climate. I know climate is a large part of the focus that we're doing here, but I think it is also compounded by the cascading challenges of the pandemic, the effects, the legacy effects of that, of high interest rates, of course, the various geopolitical challenges in terms of conflicts, high prices, high interest rates, and so forth and so on. So all of these have come together, and I shouldn't say come together nicely, but they've come together in a fairly pernicious way to impact, in particular, small economies. Now, why do we say that? Because the current literature, the research, the empirical data is showing quite significantly, as panelists have pointed out, that the Caribbean and small island developing states generally, that SIDS generally, have been the hardest hit and the slowest to recover. And the reason for this is obviously because of our size and limitations or structural constraints or imbalances and so forth and so on in our capacity to recover, but also because of the rapidity of the crises. Before, as Joala would tell you, we would have crises, every 10 years, major global ones. Now these are coming with a degree of rapidity. So it means that it takes more money to be able to withstand, more money to, when the crisis hits, you have to get resources. If you're not producing those resources internally in terms of your domestic capital mobilization, then you have to borrow it. And if you have to borrow it, then you obviously are putting yourself in debt. The question then is, how do you recover between this crisis and the next? If the rate of recovery is not fast enough, then of course you're going to meet the next crisis still in a recovery mode and have again to defend. And I think this is what is happening. So it has piled on to the extent where, as Joala has said, several SIDS are now considered to be either in debt distress or lunging towards debt distress. So the international community knows this. The empirical data is there. And therefore, the issue is, how can we respond with speed, as the colleague just said, and scale? Those are the two things that we require. For example, it is said that in the context of resilient infrastructure, for example, to do adaptation and, of course, mitigation, and build resilience in, say, Caribbean territories, for example, it's going to take about $66 to $67 billion over the next 7 years. Over the next 6 years, 7 years, to be able to even get on par with being able to meet those challenges head on as they're coming, because we know the systems are becoming more intense, larger, more impactful. $66 billion. That's a huge amount. That's a multiples of the GDPs that we have either individually or collectively as a region in the Caribbean. So the issue is, how do you close the gap between what you currently have now, which is an impending debt crisis among several countries who are in debt distress or lunging towards debt distress, getting them in a position where they can make investments, strategic investments in health, education, infrastructure, commercial activity, and so forth and so on. And then allow them to be able to grow their economies by making further investments into commercial activities through diversification of the economy, away predominantly from services like tourism or even from basic commodity production and agriculture. And that requires resources. So while you're struggling to pay off debt, while you're struggling to maintain defenses, coastal systems and elsewhere, housing and that kind of thing, to withstand the next hurricane or storm that might come, you then also have the pressure of making strategic investments into your economy. And how do you do that? It is very difficult, but you have to have cooperation among the people that matter. And who are the people that matter in this? It's the multilateral institutions, and I mean externally, that is, the multilateral institutions, the IFIs, and the private sector. Those are the two major elements that can, through a process of reform, through a process of investment, through a process of working with us to be able, SIDS that is, to be able to transform our economies, that we are going to be able to at least make significant progress. If we can't get that done, if the rate of change in terms of the MDBs relative to access to concessional financing, either through IDA or through new instruments put on the table, for example, as expressed in Bridgetown for 30 to 50-year instruments to allow people to be able to pay debt at lower rates, lower interest rates with longer tenors, unless we're going to get that type of change, or unless we're going to get change where private companies are incentivized to invest in major adjustments, major transformations, major productive activities in small island developing states to allow them to grow their economy at a faster rate, to be able to have the domestic capital mobilization that you require through your regular activities and revenues and taxes and so forth and so on. Unless those major players come on board and take some responsibility, then I think we are going to be having this conversation for a very long time, whilst, of course, our citizens suffer. And that, I think, is the pause that I would put right now on it. There are some solutions that I would like to suggest, but as it is, the situation, Geneva colleagues, is not the brightest and is not the best. But yet there's hope that we can make some progress and make that progress quickly enough to meet the challenges that are coming downstream most inevitably.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that. Very enlightening weigh-in. Pat, could you also weigh in?
Sure. Thank you to CPDC and thank you to the other members of the panel. A lot has been said that had been brought to mind already, so I will quickly include what I think has not been included so far, which is looking at the reform of systems in terms of decision-making. We have systems from the OECD DAC side of the house in terms of vulnerability, in terms of how decisions are made as to who can access concessional monies. There has been talk about a vulnerability index for some time. I think until that is finalized, we will continue to go in circles about those conversations. But one of the systems reforms that may need to be accelerated is how governments themselves make decisions. How do governments prioritize what they want to see done first? The problem seems overwhelming, and governments should be able to say, you know what, even though we know we have to fix everything, we want to fix it in this order. Also, systems reform that look at engaging with the private sector, both private sector writ large, big private sector, but also micro and small businesses and how they can be included in decision making, but also in investment tools as well. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. So we started hearing about solutions. So we got a sense of what's going on in SIDS. And thank you for that. So I know for me, certainly as a student coming up years ago, and even now with the calls for reform, we hear a lot of buzzwords. We hear about climate finance, we hear about climate resilient debt clauses and resilience and sustainability trusts. We hear all these different acronyms and buzzwords floating around. What I really want to hear from the panel right now is really, how do you all view these definitive swaps, and what is your take on that? What's your perspective on what is currently on the table in terms of solutions and mechanisms and tools? And to what extent are they applicable? To what extent can they bring about the success or the development or the resilience that we're looking for? And I would start with you, Pat, given that you were the last one to speak, and then we would go maybe round.
Okay, thank you. So in my career, I wore a couple of hats. One of them, I was heading up the work of the Nature Conservancy for the Eastern Caribbean. And I was involved in the world's first debt for nature swap in Seychelles, and also involved in identifying potential candidates in the Caribbean, of which I identified Barbados and Belize, and I'm pleased to see that I've lived long enough for those to come about. Debt swaps are an interesting tool, but there is a substantial enabling environment that needs to be put in place for them to work. If we look at the one for the Seychelles, it took them about 9 years to get that one done. Belize had some innovative tools put on for their swap to make it work. So Willis Towers Watson put a wrapper on their debt. That means if there is some sort of disaster that strikes, there's an insurance product that will step in to reinforce the payouts on that debt. The financial sector needs to continue to develop tools because the products don't stand by themselves. The innovation shown comes from all levels. We also need things like data to support modeling that supports wrappers, insurance, etc. So all of that to say we're dealing with a very complicated space, but I think more and more players are coming to the table and speaking to each other. So we'll see how things progress from there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Joala, I saw you look ever so slightly when she was speaking. So I'm going to hand the mic to you. The baton is going to you next. Could you weigh in on what are your perspectives on the instruments, such as the CRDCs, the climate resilient debt clauses, on what is currently on the table? I know that this is your area of expertise, or so you've been told.
So I've been told.
So could you please weigh in and let us know what you think about them as somebody who's actively in the field?
All right, thanks. The smoke was just due to the heat. Nothing else. First on the debt for nature swaps or debt for climate swaps. I mean, as Pat indicated, I mean, these are not new instruments. They've been around for a long time. What changed the game itself was the Seychelles debt swap that many SIDS saw as a very good example that they could take on board and emulate and, attempt to undertake some more debt swaps. And from what I understand, Nature Conservancy came into the play to provide that sort of support. I think the main issue with debt swaps is that they don't really provide the debt reduction that is anticipated. It is only in the case of Belize that a debt reduction has taken place out of all the debt swaps that we've seen so far. And that is because that was related to the nature of the debt. This was private sector debt that was trading at a considerable discount. Belize was already in default because Belize is what we call a serial defaulter in the words of the international financial community. So the investors simply expected that that debt would at some point, may not even be repaid. Right? And that's why it was trading at a considerable discount. I think almost 60% to par, if I remember the number, right? I could be corrected. And that then meant it provided an opportunity to do a structure that you could come in, buy this debt at a considerable discount and pay off your investors. And that was done through a blue bond, right? If I remember. So in that sense, that is how Belize got a debt stock reduction, right? I think it was like about 25% debt stock reduction because that Eurobond in particular was a large part of its external debt. But Barbados, which followed through on a similar structure, that didn't happen because it was more of what we call a liquidity management operation, simply just creating some fiscal space and pushing the debt flow further outside, right? So I think what we need to just understand when we look at SIDS, when we look at Caribbean SIDS is if you're going into a debt for nature swap, you've got to be very particular about what's the structure of the debt, what's the type of debt that could make sense, and then how that deal is likely to be structured. Now, I know Pat is here, but from a civil society perspective, there have been issues raised around debt swaps, particularly the major one for Belize and then the Galapagos debt swap is simply this. One, that the transparency around the swap. Outside of government and even limited parts of government, Ministry of Finance, those responsibility for the environment, the rest of the country really didn't know much about what was happening around the swap, why the swap was being done, what was the process. And I think that, again, is a lesson as we move forward in terms of providing that kind of information. The second was there seemed to be little consultation with the communities on the ground where that swap would actually impact them, right? And again, that's another lesson. And the third was really the concerns around the SPV that was created for both Belize and Galapagos. And that, particularly in Belize case, it was almost as if the government gave up its sovereignty regarding that debt swap because that SPV, the governance structure is such that it is really one that comes from the outside of the country, right? So my take on this is simply debt swaps they're not bad because they're an instrument. It is how we structure the swap so that it makes sense for the country.
Thank you very much, Joala. I saw you, Maureen, nodding. I would like you to weigh in because I saw that you had something to say, but also I realized that the focus of your organization and your particular set of SIDS is really that of the ocean economy. So what are your views on some of the solutions that are out there? And you could also weigh in on the debt swaps issue and also the clauses.
So obviously this whole week we would have heard that, oceans is quite critical to SIDS. I mean, if you're looking at the blue economy, everyone's saying that it's worth between $3 to $6 trillion in value. SIDS overall, we occupy about 16% of total EEZs in the world. So obviously the ocean is quite central when we're looking at it from an economic point of view. But I want to just emphasize the question about how governments take decision to diversify economies, real economies. Really. And so we know that tourism, again, I think the Prime Minister of Antigua was stressing yesterday that, tourism is significant. For my country, it's 40%, but it plays such a significant role in real economy, and it's dependent on a healthy ocean, right? Tourism is critical. Fisheries, both from a livelihoods, food security point of view, is critical for our people and globally, right? So fisheries is critical. Then we're looking at the new kinds of sectors that are emerging and of interest, which includes energy, where renewable energy is being flagged, minerals, critical minerals, and everybody is looking at minerals on our ocean floors, including in areas beyond national jurisdiction, to diversify economies, and marine genetic resources. These are the kind of new frontier areas that we need to move to. One of the biggest concerns, and I hate to be the canary in the coal mine here, but the way we've done green economy and with the ocean as the next site of industrialization, we simply cannot move the same way. And I think it's really necessary to caution the way our governments are going down, particularly in relation to deep sea mining. It's our salvation. And for most of our countries, particularly from PSIDS, it is our economic lifeline. And the contradictions about tourism, fisheries, and minerals, you're saying to them that actually you can't have all three. So in real economy, I think there is something to be said when you are debt stressed, because governments are now looking at minerals as their only pathway to economic salvation. And I think that makes and locates that as a way to bring revenues to our countries a very, very problematic one. I want to simply just say that and come back to the point about we need to go back to a climate justice lens when we're looking at climate financing, because I think these new kinds of market mechanisms and instruments, we're hearing it. It is really intensely technical. It requires a lot of outside knowledge and capacities for innovation around financing for solution. But I want to bring us back to real accountability around climate justice. The $100 billion that was pledged needs to be honored, because it needs to be on the table today, not tomorrow. And I think we as SIDS need to be very particular. That common but differentiated polluter pays needs to come back centrally on the table right now while we're looking at market-based mechanisms and instruments that are really, really problematic. And I think we also should ask ourselves whether these instruments and mechanisms will do what SIDS needs, which is to bring down greenhouse gas emissions. Will they do that? Or are we simply giving developed countries yet another pass? And I find myself in climate debates really concerned that when we're talking about innovation, whose innovation are we talking about? I think we have to be very clear. And I think the things that I want to flag is the polluter pay mechanism that our countries are leading, because that is essential. That is real. This is not a mechanism that, and I think we should rally as civil society and as SIDS behind these kinds of mechanisms. The IMO efforts of carbon, paying for carbon, those are real proposals to really look at it from a climate justice lens. But I think it's very important that we recognize that our countries are desperate. And when you're desperate, you're taking innovation proposals that are super technical, where we are dependent on somebody else to come and set it up. My government just launched blue bonds. And we haven't learned that we launched a sovereign bond not so long ago. We did one thing right. We bought back before things went messy, but we haven't learned. Now we've launched blue bonds and we haven't consulted our people. We never take our people along in any of these innovation proposals. So I think we need to challenge the kinds of frameworks and narratives that are coming to us through a climate justice lens. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, a moving speech. Thank you. Thank you. Cheryl, I'm leaving you for last because I have a specific question for you. But Chris, I would like to hear your views on some of the proposals, but with specific reference to the Bridgestone initiative. As we were made aware yesterday, there was the launch of the Bridgestone 3.0, and also the Accra Marrakesh agenda, which is a V20 instrument. I just want to get a sense of what your thoughts are in terms of those moving the agenda forward.
I think, thanks, Geneva. I think that both of those have, they're pretty much aligned, so to speak, in terms of what they're requesting and requiring of the international community. And that really is a change of footing, a change of platform, which allows developing countries, particularly SIDS, to and least developed economies, to have a greater say in the international system. I think people believe now, genuinely and with much credibility, that our absence from the table is a significant impediment to a basic understanding and appreciation of the challenges. Yes, the research is there. Yes, the data is there, but the actions that we see coming out, particularly, for example, I'll give a classic example. Debt resilient clauses, the pause clauses, as we call them, in debt instruments. When we were promoting that in Bridgetown, for example, and elsewhere, first there was a pushback on it. Then there was acceptance. Yes, if a country has a disaster and it needs assistance, we really should not be extracting large amounts of interest and principal payments out of countries whilst they're recovering from a major disaster. So yes, we appreciate that. Okay, so then here's what we'll do. We'll give you, or we'll grant you a pause on interest payments, but you should do principal, or principal payments that you should do interest. So you have to fight through that. Then it says we're going to do it on new debt. And this is a whole 18 months, a year, 3 years, 4 years that we're fighting on this thing, you know. Then you say we're going to do new debt. Then we say, well, you can't do new debt. You have to do existing debt. Then you say, okay, yes, you're going to do existing debt, but you're going to have to pay a fee. In other words, there's going to be a penalty for what I am giving you. So, and therefore, our position is, why would it have taken so long between acceptance that this is a challenge for countries that are faced with exponential threats from climate, to you agreeing in finality that you should give them a whole cake to eat and not a half of a cake, and say, well, you know, you get through as best as you can. And we're saying that part of the problem is the undemocratic nature of some of the institutions, or the lack of inclusiveness, let me put it that way, of the institutions, does not portend to our issues and the issues which you have heard so credibly raised here at the table being put as strongly and as frontally in the boardrooms of these organizations by small island developing states. The second point is that in the context of all of the instruments which we have and which have been propagated, the major one, frankly, in my view, is how do you, and I know there's pushback in civil society on this, and I support some of what the civil society organizations are saying because it's credible. But how do you get private capital in a public space in an equitable, reasonable, and cost affordable way to assist countries in doing the big things that they require, particularly along resilience building against climate? How do you get that done? You can't get that done if you continue to do piecemeal efforts at reforming international institutions. So both Bridgetown and Accra to Marrakesh are saying we need big transformational changes, so that we have things like the hybrid capitals, so that we have the callable capital expansions, so that we have a liberalization of the rules governing how we access, for example, IMF funds and so forth and so on. But then tying these through guarantees, corporate guarantees, multilateral guarantees, and so forth and so on, to unlocking private resources. But private resources in a way, unlocking it in a way that it does not overwhelm the public sector, overwhelm the country, and allow now for a transfer, a net transfer of income from small island developing states or lower income economies into industrialized economies. And that calls for serious conversations at the table and negotiations. These, as you said, are very complicated instruments. And you know, I heard Jawalo made a very critical point about debt swaps. It is a debt swap. It is not a debt cancellation. You're swapping the debt on one set of platforms onto another set of platforms to do some slightly different things, perhaps with a little ease. And in some instances, some do not even produce an ease in that regard. So the point that the colleague has made last spoke, we have to get back to basics. And the basic is we need debt cancellation. Some of the debt which has been incurred by small island developing states simply ought not to be repaid in the manner in which it's being repaid, or significantly reconstituted so that it is pushed back, like the wartime bonds that Prime Minister Motley likes to speak about so fondly, that were issued by the UK in the reconstruction after World War II. 100-year bonds, or whatever the case may be, at very minimal interest rates, long term, so that they have very minimal impact. But first basics is to really look at this debt, profile it out, and see which parts of it can be cancelled. Now, I'll tell you this last one, I think, is a challenge. You know that a significant proportion of the debt hold by SIDS is really multilateral debt. And in the context of all the instruments that have been proposed so far, the Common Framework, the SSI, and so forth and so on, there's no participation of multilateral institutions in this whatsoever, because the multilateral institutions are afraid of losing their preferred creditor status from the ratings agency if they participate in canceling or allowing countries to default or restructure multilateral debt. So that is a conversation that has to take place, because increasingly, countries who are not able to go to the private market increasingly have to rely on multilateral debt. And if multilateral debt is a significant proportion, more than 30%, sometimes 40% of your debt profile, then if you're having a conversation on restructuring debt, whether restructuring, reconstituting, or canceling, the multilateral institutions are going to have to enter into that conversation. The question is, who is going to bring them kicking and screaming to the table in that particular regard?
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you for giving that perspective. I think it's something that we needed to hear. We know it, but it's almost as if we don't know it, or we know it, but we don't acknowledge it. But now that we're talking about tools and mechanisms, I would like to go across to Cheryl. I know that the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator, they have established a map to monitor climate finance flows into the region. Can you tell us a little bit more about that so that we get a sense of where this fits into this entire ecosystem that we're speaking about that is needed to move us forward?
Sure. But before I do that, I also want to share my comments on the question of debt swaps and tools that are available for debt management. I think we've heard the pros and cons across all of our panelists. And I think certainly from our perspective as an organization that is focused on supporting the region in achieving its climate ambitions, I think I support the calls for justice. I support the calls for transparency and accountability in how we develop those instruments. But I also want to support the action that happens at the level of the governments to provide some solutions to the problems that they face. I want to support the focus on innovation and solutions and encourage that we continue to move forward with the lessons that we have learned from these instruments that have been put in place already. I think we need to take the lens of what can we do better? What do we need to standardize? What can we replicate? But what do we need to change to make these things work more effectively for our governments and for our people? I'd also want to focus in on the fact that there are complex instruments. Even in the private sector, a turnaround or workout is a complex venture. And I don't necessarily see that we can remove the complexity from the situation, but certainly the transparency and ensuring that there is accountability to our people needs to be improved and built in as we move forward. So I'd want us to continue to innovate in the use of these instruments and to understand clearly what an instrument can deliver and what it can deliver for a particular country. As we would have heard, the objectives of the different countries who have executed debt swaps so far have been very different. So I would want us to understand, certainly as practitioners, but be able to support our policymakers and our governments in bringing people along and understanding that this solution, while it may have a name that everybody uses, may work in a different way or deliver the solution in a different way for our country because our problem was a little bit different. So I think we need to be very clear on that. So I want to say, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, simply because we understand that there have been challenges, some challenges with the initial implementations. So as an organization, we work across three main pillars for the delivery of climate action support for the region. We work across renewable energy, the 30 by 30 agenda, as well as projects that build physical and economic resilience. And our overarching objective is to create the world's first climate smart zone in the Caribbean. So how do we do that? How do we know that what our starting point was? How do we know that we're getting there? So our climate smart map is our fourth pillar of work that helps us to understand the dimensions within the Caribbean region. It's a digital tool that aggregates information on climate action, where we are now, and progress towards achieving climate targets across the region. So we launched a tool at COP28 last year in November, having populated the tool with some critical information. So for instance, demographic information on countries, NDCs, if countries have adaptation plans, vulnerabilities, risk, losses from events, a suite of information that can help anyone looking at the region understand where we are now and over time track our progress towards the achievement of climate objectives. So some of the dimensions and data points include funding flows. We also list projects on the map. So you would be able to understand from the status of a project, what funding it is seeking, what funding it has been able to attract, and provide some preliminary information on finance flows into the region. We also have, through some of our other data points, information, as I said, on countries, on adaptation plans that may help you understand what's happening at the country level, and may also help you understand what's happening at the private sector level. We also provide links to other critical tools in the map. So if there are other organizations who have data tools, similar maps, data sources that may be relevant to our understanding of climate action in terms of the core work, as well as how you would engage to fund projects, to aggregate projects, and to collaborate towards climate action across the board, we do have that information on the map as well. So it provides the opportunity for a potential investor, for instance, to look at the landscape in the Caribbean region, understand where there may be hotspots for particular climate action subsectors, and make a rational decision on, do I want to invest in this group of countries, or do I want to invest in this region for this particular subsector because I do have capital to deploy? One of the biggest challenges that we face in the region relates to scale, particularly when we're looking at private finance. I sit on an advisory committee for a climate action organization that provides technical support for the establishment of financial instruments for the LAC region, so Latin America and the Caribbean. And the Caribbean is grouped along with countries from the top of South America all the way down to the bottom. They recently had a selection process, and what you find is that there's a drowning out of the Caribbean because the ability of an instrument, a potential instrument, to support an industry within a country like Brazil, a subsector of agriculture within Brazil, such that they don't have to deploy capital outside of the borders because of the scale of that industry in the country. We do not have that luxury. So when persons look at the Caribbean potentially for investment, they have to be looking at across borders. And then to support that, you need information. Mm-hmm. So you need to be able to look and see, are there similar initiatives? what is happening with this subsector or this sector across the Caribbean region. Because even the size of a project in the Caribbean is so different to what you would experience outside of the region. Projects may be looking for $50,000, whereas in the US or Central or South America, they're looking for 5 million. The transaction costs associated with the due diligence even for an organization is the same regardless of where the organization is and what the ticket size is.
Yeah.
So for someone with millions of dollars to deploy, the cost of deploying $50,000, doing the work to deploy $50,000 doesn't make sense. And we often have persons who have capital to deploy say to us, you know, our minimum ticket size is actually 5 million. We have 25 projects looking for $50,000 to $250,000. So having that information available can help potential investors as well as potential project owners make rational decisions about how they allocate capital, what they may do to scale, need to do to scale and aggregate, and hopefully get us to the point where we can accelerate climate action by fostering partnership and collaboration to be able to help us move the needle a lot more quickly. So that's a preliminary on how it helps potentially investors.
Thank you. That sounds quite promising. I
very
had a
good.
look at it and I would have really wanted us to have it up, but at the end of these discussions,
Sure.
we'll be sure to extend.
I can share the
the
QR code.
and
Yeah.
everything like that. Now, because it's quite an innovative tool, and I think it will have quite a lot of utility in the region. But we're talking about projects in the region, so Pat, I will turn to you. You have a new designation. You are chief of party for the well, it's not on yet, but I guess it's on stream. But you could tell us a little bit more about the USAID Reset project and how what kind of successes or potential do you think it's going to bring to development in the region, especially by way of financing certain initiatives?
Thank you. So I am the new, for the last month, chief of party, which people is like, what, you're holding a party? That is USAID's designation for their CEO of a project that will be active in 11 Caribbean countries. As someone who is coming from bilateral world with the UK and being constrained by ODA, I'm excited to say that I'll be working in high-income countries such as Bahamas and Barbados for maybe the first time in my development career. Working in looking at precipitating private and capital finance for climate resilience. The name of the project is a Caribbean Resilient Economies and Sectors Program. And it will be $20 million over 5 years. It has 3 main pillars, looking at helping governments make decisions on looking at innovative ways to get debt sorted, but it is also looking at top-down and bottom-up involvement of private sector at the big P private sector. So working with CARICOM private sector organization to look at some innovation there, but also looking at little p, which I consider micro and small business sectors, working with CPDC on working with indigenous communities, vulnerable persons, to also get them involved in the equation. So we've just been on board for a month. We are not fully staffed up. We anticipate by September we'll have a proper rollout with a work plan. So you can watch this space.
Oh, yes, and we certainly look forward to working with you all on that, given the mandate that our organization has, and that's really to work with grassroots organizations and ensure that their needs are met and their voices are heard. So definitely we look forward to that. And we'll be sure to put on the CPDC site any additional information that comes in. So anybody could go to cpdcngo.org and see the developments in terms of that kind of financing project. So I would now go over to Joala in terms of what's the current status of climate finance in the region, in the Caribbean region, And what does this mean for countries' ability to address climate crises and their debt levels? And what do you think needs to be done? What more can be done by way of bringing in finance into the region? I know we hear a lot about private investment, and Chris mentioned that, and that's a topic that we heard at the Springs recently in Washington and other political events. But what is really needed, and what is happening right now?
All right, another depressing so here's the thing. 2023, we had negative financial transfers to the developing countries. What does that mean? It simply means developing countries paid out more in debt service last year than they received in debt and official development finance, right? Aid flows. That to me paints the picture at the global level of what it is we're facing. And 2023 is not an anomaly. The expectation is that we're going to see significant outflows again in 2024 and in 2025. And that is simply because, as I said earlier, there is this wave of debt servicing that will be taking place by developing countries. And if we put that in the context of the fact that the developing countries outside of China require about $1 trillion per year in external finance to 2030 to meet their climate goals, it tells you the scale, right, of the issue facing us. And if we bring all that back down, and we spoke earlier about the $100 billion pledge, right, which kept reinventing itself from Copenhagen to Paris, right? And now we're moving into a new collective quantified finance goal, right? Which hopefully with the right push is not going to go that route. But what we knew that up to this year is that the global North countries never met that $100 billion pledge, right? There is, of course, a report out now by the OECD recently released that said for 2022, they have met that pledge. As a matter of fact, the number is close to $115 billion, right? So clearly they've met the target based on the OECD report. We've had over the years, every time they say they're close to the target, we've had civil society come in, especially Oxfam, go back and go through the numbers and find out that, that's not true, right? The last time Oxfam did the reconciliation, they came down to close to about $83 billion. So that's a significant deviation, right? So we're waiting to see if this will happen. Here's the other thing. There's an analysis just came out yesterday by Reuters and Stanford University that said, when we look at the top 4 climate donors in the world, the United States, Germany, France, and Japan, we find some issues that they are lending at market rates, which is not supposed to happen. And with the lending, they're tying it to conditions that you've got to hire this company, this consultant, or take projects from the global North. So that in itself is contributing back, right? A flow back. And if we look at the grants, it's actually the same thing, that the grants are also tied. So we have an issue here of, while the flow may come, there is actually a negative resource flow at the end, or maybe even much lower than anticipated. And then much of these flows to the Caribbean region come in the form of loans. And we already talked about that. That means you're simply tacking on more and more debt. And while they've come in the form of loans, again, most were on the mitigation side. We've hardly had enough on adaptation, which we know is critical for the Caribbean. So we have a significant adaptation funding gap here in the region. And then we have the other issue, loss and damage, right? Which I think was beautifully covered so far in this conference. So there's not much that I could say except that we need to get this fund adequately capitalized and fully operationalized as soon as possible. Right? I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Joala, for that insight. I would turn to you, Maureen. Could you speak from a specific level, or you could just speak about it generally from a global standpoint?
Maybe just three key points. And the first is that on the existing climate funds that we have, whether it's GEF in particular, for the Pacific, it's not a big fund for us. In part, questions of scale. We struggle with questions of scale. The average time for a submission to first disbursement of funds takes about 41 months for full-size projects. So that one piece, it hasn't really gone after Jeff. On the GCF funding, I mean, again, SIDS have received 1.4 billion for 59 approved projects, including multi-regional. So in existing finance, climate finance, it's still not reaching us, right? But perhaps I want to turn to two other sources of finance that I think, which kind of demonstrates who's shouldering the burden of climate disasters and recovery and rebuilding resilience, right? And in the case of Fiji, our debt is 60% national, which is held by our pension fund, right? That's workers. They held us through COVID and recovery. That's where our government is going to borrow through the pension or through labor of our workers. Our pension fund is our cash cow in finance. Secondly, because I come from civil society, that the social safety net, whilst we try to resolve at the multilateral level on climate financing, is again shouldered by labor through remittances. So if we look at remittances in the Pacific, they play such a critical role in economy. For a country like Tonga, it's almost 50% of their GDP. For Vanuatu and Tuvalu, it constitutes up to 27% of GDP. My country is 9%. That's no small feat. But that's our social safety net. We're not looking at anyone else to do reconstruction work around climate and climate disaster. It is labor sweat of our people. When we look at transaction costs for one remittance, we have the highest in the world, 9%, which means that 79 million is captured by and held and doesn't reach the countries that are remittance dependent. So I think when we're looking at financing, for us, we are inwardly looking to mobilize our pension funds, which remains, but they are being pressured because governments cannot access financing of pension funds disproportionately carry the burden of climate finance.
Thank you very much. And we would just go across to Chris now before we go into the question and answer segment.
Yes, thank you. And I think that I support the almost entirely the comments made by the last two speakers relative to the pressure that we are going to be facing going forward in terms of trying to see how we can scale instruments. Obviously, because of the smallness of the economies, the level of intervention in the market space is not going to be sufficiently large to attract the kind of funding that we require and to interest private investors and also to interest even some public sector investors in terms of the different funds that exist bilaterally. in countries. And so the issue is how do we begin to create a platform across different countries in specific regions or specific countries in different regions to be able to allow them to join in supporting what now we are commonly referring to as GPGs, global public goods, whether it is in public health, whether it is in climate, whether it's in digitization of economies, whether it is in alternative energy, and general greening of the economy. These are some of the specific areas that we will need to be able to address frontally from a size perspective. So how can we develop not just innovative instruments, but also innovative products for intervention to solve some of the challenges that we have facing, particularly along the front of climate and so forth and so on, to ensure that enough scale and liquidity is there that investors, both public and private, will be interested in getting. And I think the key to that is in the multilateral institutions. The multilateral institutions are best placed to be able to assist small island developing states to create those instruments and to build those constructs that will allow them to scale what can be very small, miniature in financial terms, national projects into regional projects or national projects with regional reach. And I think that in the context of that, we are seeing some very interesting things emerge from some of the multilateral institutions, particularly the regional development banks. And I think that's critical. Another critical part of also financing this type of action is utilizing what has now been, nominally freed up SDRs. As you know, the IMF has agreed to allow SDRs now to be used as tradable currency in development banks. So regional development banks can now access SDRs. And as Bridgetown 3.0 is suggesting, and others are suggesting, that some of the developed countries who have excess of SDRs that they're not using, they're just on their books, can in fact release some of those SDRs so that they can be placed, bought, purchased, acquired by regional development banks. And those regional development banks can then use those resources in a pooled way to help give smaller economies the type of scale that they're required to do transformational projects in their country, particularly in the areas of infrastructure and resilience building and so forth and so forth and so on. And of course, ultimately asking institutions like the IMF to actually issue more SDRs to deal with the current crises that we have, because the level of concessional financing that is going to be required, it cannot be acquired through the regular means of what we now have on the board. And we know what happened with the 650 billion SDR that was distributed during COVID, and how unequal and uneven that was done. And we feel that in the context of what is happening now and what is required relative to the amount of resources necessary to help us to meet the SDGs and to build serious resilience going forward past 2030 and into the next 10, 15 years, that those new allocation of SDRs are required with a degree of immediacy and urgency to assist us in this respect. So I think that there are some options out there, but the question is whether the political will will is there. And I think Joala's point on the very finally on the whole question of flows. We've heard, as he said, about the 100 billion pledge, which is supposed to be $100 billion every year, by the way. And that has not been really met in any given year. And even though we are hearing about $115 billion being pledged, the thing is that is more of a gross figure, because as Joala said, when you then net that off for some of the things which occurs, it really comes back down, I think, around the Oxfam figure of about 80 odd billion dollars, maybe as much as 90 on a very good day. But otherwise than that, that system has to be significantly reformed if that $100 billion is to really make it through with any degree of seriousness and credibility.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a very, I guess, I don't want to say sobering again, but I think for me, it has definitely opened my eyes, and I've seen a few nods and shakes throughout the audience. And that says a lot about the information that we would have gotten today. So now I turn to the audience, and just to stimulate you all a bit. I really want to ask you all, I mean, I know that you all may have some questions to the panelists, but I'll stimulate you all with this question. What do you see as key priorities for addressing the debt crisis and mobilizing more climate finance? What is that you think is needed? And think about your sectors, think about your particular industries. And if you have any questions, please feel free at this point to channel them this way to the audience. Yes. Naveen?
Oh, I'm gaming from the organization Caribbean States. Is this mic on? Oh yeah. It's for online. So Joel, I just wanted to ask you to clarify something you said. You said, I think, that SIDS were spending more in debt service than they were receiving in financing through loans or ODA. And is that just interest, or is that interest and principal?
It would depend. It would depend on.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Not hearing
Wow.
Joel.
Yeah.
You have to give him the microphone.
Okay. Yeah. And I also just wanted to follow on from, I think he's called Chris on the online. He brought up SDRs, and I wanted to know, because there's been some, I guess, conflicting reports, how vital in 2021, when the general allocation of 650 billion SDRs was when they were distributed, how vital was that for liquidity in the Caribbean? Obviously there were issues around the quotas and Caribbean states not getting their fair share, obviously because they've got such a small quota. But is our regular general allocation something that we should be pushing for in the region as a necessity?
Well, any allocation is better than none at all. Most of those allocations came during COVID, as you know, but that particular allocation came during COVID. And for example, a island like Barbados got just over 200 million US dollars worth of SDRs. And that's significant. In the middle of a crisis, I mean, that helped considerably, because it allowed the country to be able to do things to defend its interests relative to the impact of COVID, the shutdown of the economy, the loss of earnings, and so forth and so on. Now, you would prefer that if there is an allocation, that allocation does not come in the middle of a crisis, because once it comes in the middle of a crisis, you know exactly where the money is going to go. And crisis fighting is good, because it helps you to be able to stabilize internally and then hopefully recover from there. If it comes in a situation where you are not under such severe pressure, it means that you can then take those resources transparently, as somebody has been mentioning on the chat, transparently, and invest those in critical areas of development. Not just building resilience, but also creating the platform for economic growth. Look, in the Caribbean, for example, in the 10 years prior to COVID, and I went through some of this as Minister of Finance, particularly in the post 2007, 2008 financial meltdown, economies in the Caribbean grew at a rate of 1%. 1% growth in that decade. And since then, the growth levels obviously were impacted significantly by COVID, are only now beginning to, Caribbean is one of the last regions to begin to come back to pre-COVID levels. So you're going back to a pre-COVID level that was already very low. And this is because strategic investments cannot be made because governments did not have the fiscal space. So we're saying that if new allocations of SDRs can be done fairly and equitably, where countries who really require those resources can get them and invest them transparently and strategically in the sectors that are emerging or in existing sectors to differentiate the product to make them more competitive and attractive so that you can get greater foreign direct investment flows into the country to help grow the economy, then it helps you at a level to be able to grow your economy, improve your domestic capital mobilization, and have to rely less on borrowing money internationally at rates that are not that are prohibitive. Let me put it that way. So, you know, an SDR thing would help. But of course, it calls for one, political will, and two, the capacity for the institutions to be able to take those decisions. And that comes back down to the shareholders, and in particular, the major shareholders of the institution.
Chris, I just want to check in online with our participants to see if there are any questions or comments that right? I know that Chris addressed one. Okay, well, we have 5 more minutes, so I think that now is the time I should probably close. Do you have, we'll take one more question and then we'll close, right? The gentleman.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I just want to ask one question and then I just want to make a general comment. The question is, are we all very confident within ourselves that at SIDS, what is really required to address these issues you have raised are really being done? Having said that, sometimes you have the general notion that we are simply spinning our top deeper and deeper into the mud that we are trying to lift ourselves out of. Now, we have said so many things here, and we have raised, I think, very good prescriptions. Inclusiveness, being at the table, making the decisions. Now, who are making the decisions for us? Who are giving us the prescriptions? So if we know what are our challenges, as I ask the questions, are we really addressing it in the way that we should? Are we really putting forward peculiar solutions to address our peculiar circumstances? If that is not the case, and we keep speaking about the challenges, about the prescriptions, which we know are driving us deeper into these situations, then what really is the solutions? Now, let me just sum up because I know we don't have time. Are we really addressing these issues in a politically correct way? Or are we really embracing them, speaking plainly, addressing difficult conversation and difficult matters? Finally, I know that it is not as simple. I understand the challenges, but we have to face this head on in a very realistic, practical way, and not just being politically correct. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. I really don't know how to close after that. I think that was a good, you know, thank you for summing that up, and thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Chris, for making the time for us, and thank you for everyone who's been here today, really taking this in heat with us. And please feel free to reach out to our organizations accordingly, and we will be sure to give any additional information as required. So thank you very much, and do enjoy the rest of the afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.